Well, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Walfall, and I'm the Challenge Lead for Net Zero for Sustainable Futures, and I'll be hosting this afternoon. So thank you for attending this latest version of the Sustainable Futures seminar series. Today we've got another great two speakers representing research at the University of Manchester. We've got John Mackintosh, followed afterwards by Dr. Joanne Tippett. So without further doubts, we're going to start with John, and John is a PhD researcher for the Space Research Group here at the University of Manchester. His research focuses on developing sustainable design principles for future space missions. This involves Earth observation data to maximize outputs towards the UN SDGs, in addition to investigating methods to minimize environmental effects of missions, such as risk of in-orbit collisions, debris release, and mission impact on the atmosphere. In 2023, John attended the 74th International Astronautical Congress in Azerbaijan and presented a technical session on collision probability of EO satellites. Today, John will be talking about from launch to business insights, developing a framework to assess the environmental cost of satellite data with consideration of technical, economic, and governance aspects. Over to you, John. And I must warn everyone first, we're recording this session today, so please be aware of that. It'll be online at a later date. John, feel free to share your slides when you're ready.
Okay then.
That's good.
Everyone can see that fine?
That's good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, without further ado then. Hi everyone, my name is John Mackintosh. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester looking into sustainable design principles for future space missions. What I'll be talking to you about today is work I completed last summer as part of a project funded by Manchester Sustainable Futures, comprising of myself, my supervisor team, internal experts on life cycle assessment and environmental policy, and industry and partners in sustainability consulting, Kalala and 67 Green. What we were doing then is looking into developing a framework to assess the environmental impact of satellite missions in such a way that would ultimately go on to become an ESG scoring system for space missions. So the project was called From Launch to Business Insights, Developing a Framework to Assess the Environmental Cost of Satellite Data with Consideration of Technical, Economic, and Governance Aspects. Now, in 2022, there was a UK space strategy report that identified spacecraft as critical infrastructure. In part, this is due to the way the space systems can provide vital data for monitoring and responding to climate change impacts. For example, using Earth observation to assess farmland to help with the UN goal of achieving zero hunger. Now, this rise in utility does lead to more satellites in space, leading to a rapid growth in the industry. This is also being fueled by the emergence of mega constellations. These constellations of thousands of satellites, which is also being fueled by the involvement of private actors. So, for example, as of right now, there's around 10,000 satellites in orbit around the Earth, but by the end of the decade, there could be in the order of hundreds of thousands of satellites if all plans from commercial bodies and governments do go ahead. Now, with all these satellites in orbit, that does lead to issues of orbital congestion and potential risk of collision. So these in-orbit sustainability issues. But what we're more concerned with is, with more satellites in space, that means more manufacturing and more launches, and there's potentially overlooked in-atmosphere sustainability issues, which is what we'll be looking at today. So to put that into perspective, as of right now, there are no launch sites active in the UK, but in the next few years, there are plans for as many as 7. There'll be 3 vertical launch sites up in Scotland, and then 4 horizontal launch sites where the rocket would launch from a plane throughout the country. So even looking at that alone, you can understand historically this wouldn't be a concern for the UK, but if there was sustainability concerns from launch, that would be something we'd have to look into going into the future. And then if we want to put that further into perspective, looking at the situation globally, there are right now 46 operational launch sites and 26 planned, leading to 72 total. So again, that really does show moving forward with all these launch sites, if there were sustainability issues, this is something we'd have to consider. What's also immediately obvious is how inaccessible space is to the global south, which is something that this framework would also set out to mitigate. Not only is it the number of launch sites, but also the number of launches. So we can see there was 222 successful launches that went ahead last year. That's almost as many as one every 2 days. And we can see that there was a steep rise from 2019, marking the advent of mega constellations, and the numbers only going up. So say if there was an issue from harmful emissions from rocket launches, that is something that's going to have to be investigated. So with that in mind then, this was our brief. We were recognizing that incentivizing responsible behavior within the space industry would be crucial for a resilient future. And our aim is to develop a framework for assessing environmental and societal impacts of space missions. This would be to help industry stakeholders identify and address sustainability concerns to prevent negative impacts on Earth. However, that is a very broad subject, space sustainability, and we'd have to find a way of sort of narrowing it down and categorizing it and looking at specific areas. So to do that, we started with a document from 2023 produced by the Earth Space Sustainability Initiative, Memorandum of Principles for Space Sustainability. Now, this was a document that was created to promote international engagement with and management of long-term sustainability activities of outer space, where the signatories would seek to establish transparent space sustainability principles. This was a document that was signed by both industry and academia to provide common ground for addressing recognized areas of importance for sustainability in space activities, with the key word here being areas, right, as these would be the areas that we would use as the categories to build our framework around. And this being the obvious choice to go with, if they're specifically made to provide common ground and already has the approval of industry and academia. And this would all follow the Secure World Foundation definition of space sustainability, ensuring that all humanity can continue to use outer space for peaceful purposes and socio-economic benefit now and in the long term. So those categories, as laid out in the memorandum, are as follows. There was spacecraft design and manufacture, which seeks to reduce waste during the manufacture process and reduce the use of finite materials. Launch and propulsion, which would seek to use greener propellants and reduce harmful emissions into the atmosphere. Operations in space, which focuses on collaborative aspects of in-space operations, so looking to register space objects and encourage data sharing between operators. End of life and disposal, looking at sustainable end of life practices. Space debris mitigation, looking at reducing the level of space debris that is currently in orbit, either through regulations of launch vehicles and spacecraft, or through active debris removal. And then this idea of dark and quiet skies, in which with so many mega constellations, they do have the unwanted side effect of reflecting light back towards the Earth. And that can happen on such a scale, it will affect the natural brightness of the night sky. And this has negative impacts on astronomy, but also for the cultural significance of the night sky, which is important for indigenous peoples, but also just people in general, and also looking at reducing or maintaining even the natural level of noise in the night sky as well. They recognize Earth monitoring, which is the idea of the data benefits you can get from space missions, so using Earth observation to assist with the Sustainable Development Goals. And then lastly, this category for ESG they have, which focuses on the social impact and also the legal and regulatory aspects regarding space sustainability. Now, for us, when building our framework, we did decide that there's already a lot of literature and a lot of bodies looking into the in-space debris sustainability issues. So we decided that operations in space, the end of life, and debris mitigation wasn't what we were going to focus on. And also, looking at dark and quiet skies, we recognize that that is very important, but it is slightly different in nature to the other aspects we'll be looking at. It would have different detriments on the environment, different scoring categories. So that's something maybe for another group to be looking at. And Earth monitoring is something drawing attention to the benefits that space can have for sustainability rather than looking at the detriments and like ways to score that. So that's not really appropriate for us either. And then ultimately our framework will be consisting of the design and manufacture, launch and propulsion, and the ESG category, but specifically looking at the law and regulatory aspect. So in summary then, the framework we were proposing is consisting of design and manufacture with subcategories of office work and traveling, material extraction, qualification and testing and assembly, launch and propulsion that would consist of the launch campaign, that being all the events leading up to the launch, so the office work and planning and transport, and then followed by the launch event itself. And then lastly, a law and regulation category that would focus on scoring how well a mission would adhere to existing regulations regarding space sustainability. So a literature review was conducted into the various issues and mitigation strategies and scoring methods we could use for the design and manufacture stage. And we came across life cycle assessment, or LCA, this being a method for evaluating the environmental impacts of a product throughout its entire life cycle. Now, as outlined in international standards, that follows four main steps, being the goal and scope, where you define what you're looking for, the life cycle inventory, which is a database consisting of different environmental flows like inputs and outputs, say X process produces X amount of CO2. And then you have your life cycle impact assessments, where you have the stages of your life cycle of your product, associate that with the inventory, so you know the specific outputs of each stage of your product. And then lastly, interpreting those results and drawing your conclusions. However, we did find that standard LCA methods were not inclusive for all aspects of space missions. So for example, databases would generally lack data pertaining to the extraction, production, and manufacturing of some metals used in space technology, such as beryllium used in mirrors, zirconium used in ablative shielding, and germanium used in solar modules. Furthermore, they wouldn't account for emissions into the upper levels of the atmosphere, as that is something that's quite unique for space missions, or the marine effects of falling launcher stages either. So further literature review was conducted into finding space-specific life cycle assessment. We found that the ESA did have methods, but they weren't very transparent as to what went into them. But we did find at University of Strathclyde, they had developed quite a good system called the Strathclyde Space Systems Database, or the SSSD. This was even more in depth, as it included an environmental life cycle assessment, which is your standard LCA, life cycle costing, where the life cycle assessment would be looking at the cost of each aspect of the production rather than the environmental impact. And then the social life cycle assessment, looking at the social impact as opposed to the environmental impact. So once all of those three aspects are combined together, that would make for a life cycle sustainability assessment encompassing all three pillars of sustainability. But most importantly for us, it did include categories for space mission impacts like emissions in the upper atmosphere, the extraction and life cycle of those space-specific materials, space debris, and a novel metric for noise as well. This was constructed in such a way that it had traditional LCA inventories like ELCD and EcoInvent, but then built on top of that would be the space-specific Strathclyde databases. Although for some areas, like looking at ground stations and some launch and mission data, they did concede that data needed a little further validation. But by and large, that would be suitable for our purposes. We could use standard life cycle assessment for office work and traveling, and then the Strathclyde system for qualification and testing and assembly to account for space-specific aspects. Furthermore, it does have an impact category for depleting critical raw materials, and that is what we would use for the material extraction aspect of the framework. Now, we wanted to investigate further into the material extraction, as that was very important for our industry partners. And we would look into the mining processes of beryllium and germanium, and at the ethics of mining them as well. So we found research did point towards there being environmental and health risks of beryllium contamination, and there was limited information of beryllium's fate and transport in the environment, which underscored the need for further research. Germanium, used in solar modules, and cobalt for lithium-ion batteries do raise ethical concerns due to mining practices in regions like the Democratic Republic of Congo, as there's concerns around child labor and also safety concerns as well. So for this section, we're recommending transparency in the mining practices and possibly investigating further down the supply chain so that we can have ethical trade-offs between the utility of the material against the ecological destruction, pollution, and the safety concerns. So to summarize then, for this design and manufacture stage, we would have impact assessment using LCA inventory, using that for the framework scoring. Conventional LCA could be used for office work and traveling, whereas then the Strathclyde system could be used for space-specific aspects of design and manufacture. Ethics of material mining is something that we want to consider. And then further development of the Strathclyde Space Systems database would be recommended to achieve the data validation in those areas that were lacking. Moving on then, we have our next major category of launch and propulsion, where a literature review was conducted looking into what the leading concerns would be and potential scoring methods for this. And we found that it was emissions into the upper atmosphere, that being unique to space missions, is a leading concern, and the effect that would have on ozone depletion and radiative forcing. So this being the idea of unnatural energy level change in the atmosphere, which can contribute towards climate change. So say, for example, a solid rocket motor will produce inorganic chlorine that can lead to ozone depletion, or a hydrocarbon-based rocket would produce CO2, and that can lead towards radiative forcing. Furthermore, there was carbon offset companies we looked into, like 8 Billion Trees, who conducted research on the environmental impact of rocket fuel used in different space launches. And for a Falcon 9 rocket, they calculated that 336,555 kilograms of CO2 was released into the atmosphere for every launch. Now, if you want to compare that to your average car emissions, the average car for a year makes 4,600 kilograms of CO2. So that's about the equivalent of 73 cars a year for one Falcon 9 launch. Just some further points that were identified in the literature. We found that unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine spills from rocket stages can contaminate the land around spaceports. Solid rocket motors have been found to harm fish in nearby water bodies and can turn water into mild acid due to exhaust fumes. Hybrid rocket engines produce black carbon particles that can settle in the upper atmosphere, and kerosene engines emit soot, which can contribute towards atmospheric carbon. We also found that in the literature there does exist methods for carbon scoring and also modeling for radiative forcing, and we could incorporate that into the scoring for our launch event segment as well. So our key findings here then, we decided we could use conventional LCA for the launch campaign events. For the launch event itself, the Strathclyde system can be used to account for emissions into the stratosphere and for the effect of falling launcher stages. And we'd want to be recording emissions of chlorine, alumina, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and the effects that would have on climate change from ozone depletion and radiative forcing. We also want to account for the noise disturbance and use the existing literature for propulsion modeling, radiative forcing modeling, and incorporate that into our scoring system as well. And then a recommendation being similar to the previous category for the refinement of the Strathclyde Space Systems database. And that leads us into our final category, this category of law and regulation, where this would function by rating emissions adherence to existing sustainability regulations. So that would be, say, the UK Space Industry Act of 2018, or certain international standards, such as that for falling launcher stages, or more generic, such as environmental management or health and safety, and also the UN's long-term sustainability guidelines as well. So the recommendation for this section then is that it will function similarly to an aspect of an existing in-orbit space sustainability rating called the application of design and operational standards, where this rates the adherence to existing guidelines. But for them, they also choose it to function as a bonus aspect to the main score, as they believe strictly applying that could disadvantage developing space nations, which is an idea that we agreed with. So in summary then, our framework looked like this. Design and manufacture, consisting of office work and traveling, material extraction, qualification and testing and assembly, launch and propulsion, consisting of the launch campaign and the launch event, and then law and regulation, looking into scoring how well the mission would adhere to existing sustainability regulations. This is the form of the framework that we'll be using to pitch to stakeholders, where we've identified the key ESG factor and the appropriate SDG for each aspect of the framework. And for future work, we will be recommending further development into the Strathclyde Space Systems database, further research into launcher effects on the atmosphere. We want these categories and preliminary scoring ideas to be developed into a properly functioning assessment method. And this is work that's continuing in a now funded future project, visions of and step towards an environmentally sustainable space future, which will involve further engagement with stakeholders to get their take on the matter. That does bring me to the end of the presentation. I will just draw the attention to, I believe in the next seminar, the 30th of May, There's going to be a presentation from Dr. Craig Thomas, who is also a team member of ours, who will be talking about space sustainability. So if you want further information on the subject, do attend that. But with that, I will thank you all for your attention and open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, John. You've done my work for me there. So yes, please feel free to ask any questions. I'll open it. If you please put it in the chat, or make yourself aware to me in the participant list, and I will come to you. Does anyone have any questions for John? Okay, well, while you're thinking about it, I've got one here from Stephen. Stephen Lowe, hi. It's a great presentation. Have you, any of the new private launch companies, for example, SpaceX, expressed any interest in space sustainability?
Not that I'm aware of. I know there are some companies. There's a few companies in the UK that I know are kind of interested and have like made it known that they're interested in being stakeholders, like AAC Clyde Space, and I think we're even talking with Saxonwood Spaceport as well. But as far as I'm aware, none of the big, not like Amazon or SpaceX or anyone like that.
Okay, thank you. Another question here from Ian Muirhead. So fantastic presentation, John. Thank you. Is there possible governance application of this scoring, perhaps where achievement of a certain standard is formally integrated into launch licensing processes more effectively?
It's a possibility, but we were thinking it would be something that's quite hard to change, to get laws changed. And also, it's quite difficult. You might end up in a situation where you can change the law for a country, even though it's difficult, but you can't change it globally. And there's no global government that's enforcing that for everybody around the world. So the logic here is that we want this to function more similarly to an ESG system where companies are advertising their ESG credentials to maybe get more funding. And it's a way of incentivizing good behavior as opposed to forcing it legally.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. I'll ask one question. Tell us a bit more about the Strathclyde Space System database. What are you contributing to that field, or is there any future work happening in that space?
Yeah, there is future work. You know, I've spoken to the company that now owns the IP for it, and we've sort of discussed the steps that they want to move into. Now, they do find there is this idea, like generally speaking, there are a few research gaps in terms of space sustainability at the moment. So historically, people would think that bringing a spacecraft back into the atmosphere and having it burn up would be the most sustainable end-of-life procedure. But now we find that there could be concerns there that haven't been considered, like having lots of metal particles in the atmosphere, or there may be emissions from that itself if it's done on such a wide scale. So there is research that's being encouraged in that area, and they do hope to add that into the Space Systems database moving forwards. There's also research being conducted into the effect of falling launcher stages on deep sea ecology, where there's gaps in the research currently. And then that's something that they want to add into the system as well. They're just generally updating the life cycle inventory databases. And I think they want to transform it into more of a concurrent design tool so it can be used to make the most sustainable designs during the initial design process, and maybe incorporate AI in there as well to optimize sustainability as much as possible.
Very good. We've got time for one more question. So if there's anyone got any questions, or I'll jump in again. These companies are operating, are there any existing methods that they have to adhere to in terms of their space activities on land or in space, or is it a free-for-all?
No, there are some existing regulations. That's why it was important for us to add that category regarding law and regulations, because we don't want to not utilize existing like guidelines if they're out there, but maybe more of a system to try and encourage people and operators to follow them if they do exist. So there are things like the UK Space Act of 2018, where they try and minimize the level of like ozone depletion and air quality effect from launch sites, and also get launch missions to fit in like existing carbon budgets, which I think is outlined by more UK regulations as well.
Thank you for sharing with us today, John. If anyone has more questions, I'm sure he wouldn't mind if you email him afterwards. Thank you. So there's.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome. So our second speaker today is Dr. Joanne Tippett. And Joanne is a senior lecturer in the School of Environmental Education and Development. Joanne's research is very much driven by two questions. How do we imagine a sustainable future? And how can we work together effectively to achieve systematic change? Joanne began working in the field of community participation and ecological planning in the mid-90s, working in Southern Africa. Joanne is also a British Academy Innovation Fellowship awardee with the UK National Commission for UNESCO. This is to catalyse transformative sustainability learning with the RoundView. She's also inventor of Ketso, a hands-on tool for creative engagement and learning, which is now used in over 80 countries. It sounds incredibly impressive. Today, Joanne will be talking to us about learning through the RoundView, inspiring new ways of thinking about sustainable futures with libraries and community learning. Over to you, Joanne. Please share your slides. And again, please put your questions in the chat as you go along, and we'll have a chat session again at the end.
Great, thank you very much. So welcome everybody. That was a really interesting talk. This is going to be a lot about sort of community engagement. So a little bit more feet on the ground here. So learning through the RoundView. It is easy to feel completely overwhelmed in the face of climate and ecological breakdown. It's a growing problem. Young people in particular just feel that it's hard to even understand how to hope for the future. What if we knew the root causes of all environmental problems, all of these and any other environmental problem you can think of? We knew the root causes. And they were so simple that anybody from primary school to postgraduate to policymakers could understand them. So here we've even got the UK ambassador to UNESCO learning the RoundView. And they're that simple because they're based on decades of scientific consensus about how this system works as a system, plus just what every school child knows. And what if there were only 3 root causes of all of those problems? So in a system based on cycling, driven by sunlight, in which nothing but heat leaves, we could physically damage the very ecosystems we rely on. We could poison nature and wildlife with stuff that doesn't belong, that's never existed before, can't break down, doesn't belong in nature. Or we could overwhelm natural cycles with perfectly okay stuff, carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, just too much, too fast. And there's a black hole in the middle of some particularly tricky problems because they're caused by a combination of all 3. For instance, climate change, we lose the peat soils and forests and our cloud base, poison with CFCs and HCFCs, and also, of course, the classic carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So these make them particularly tricky problems. So great, we've got root causes of all environmental problems. How does this help us? So what? It's a nice diagram. Probably it's a sort of way to think about it. But the key thing that this helps us to do is, if we know the root causes of our environmental problems, we could design our systems so we don't cause those problems in the first place. We could do the opposite. So instead of physically damaging ecosystems, we need to make sure that every project or plan or decision we're making is restoring and connecting ecosystems. Instead of poisoning with stuff that doesn't belong, we need to make sure we cycle all materials in the right loop. So it's not to say that we can't have technology or plastics in the future. We just need to understand where they are, how to take them apart, and how to make sure they're constantly reused in the technical loop and don't get into nature. And anything else does get into nature. Instead of overwhelming our natural cycles with too much, too fast of perfectly okay stuff, we need to balance our flows of natural stuff. So this is where we really need to think of getting nutrients back into the soil instead of the water, and living off solar income so that we're not relying on fossil fuels and instead using the sun's power to fuel all of our activity. And there's one more guideline that we need to consider whilst we're thinking all of this, and thank you very much for talking about this in the space program as well. We need to think about the impact of our decisions on people's health and well-being. Is it reducing or increasing people's ability to live well and have healthy lifestyles and livelihoods? That is the round view that inspires hope, confidence that we're moving in the right direction, and inspiration. And this has emerged from over 2 decades of research and co-production at the University of Manchester, initially working in Tesco, where we were looking at developing sustainability skills from the shop floor to senior management, and has since been working with hundreds and hundreds of people and organizations to really get to that simplicity. And the key thing that the RoundView helps us to do is to know whether or not a decision or action that we're making is likely to move us in the right direction or not. It really this is its core. This is what it does. It helps us to ask, is this action likely to move us towards sustainability or away from sustainability? And it does this because it helps us to think systemically. Now, on one level, you might be thinking, we know all this. We already know, what we need to do, and we know that we need to be not using fossil fuels, etc. The trouble is we keep making the same mistakes. What the RoundView helps us to do is run our decisions through this supremely simple toolkit to really think, which direction are we going in? And can we avoid unintended consequences? So a classic example of this is we're putting in heat pumps all over the place in order to heat and cool our buildings using electricity, which means we could be using renewable energy and not causing overwhelm. Brilliant. Heat pumps are amazing. But many of the heat pumps that are being put in use Freon as a coolant, and Freon is a hugely potent greenhouse gas. In the RoundView framework, it's a poison. So what we need to be asking is, what are we trying to solve? Overwhelm. Are there any other possible unintended consequences? Oh, it uses a poison. Could we do something else? And it turns out, yes, indeed, there are actually a ton of heat pumps on the market that don't use Freon, instead use propane or even carbon dioxide, and are hugely, hugely less problematic for the long-term future of the climate. This is why we think that everybody would benefit from understanding the RoundView, to really embed this as a reflexive process in our decisions of thinking, always asking, is this overwhelming or balancing? Is it poisoning or cycling? Is it damaging ecosystems or restoring? What's the impact on people? Of all of our decisions, to really help us move in the right direction. The RoundView also inspires new thinking. A classic example of that has been within the Carbon Landscape Project, which is the landscape between Greater Manchester and Liverpool, which is the landscape that fueled the Industrial Revolution, the coalfields of Wigan. And we were involved in a £3.2 million 5-year lottery-funded landscape restoration project that looked at reimagining this landscape from this industrial spoiled wasteland to a connected landscape of ecological hope. And we used the RoundView as a key engagement tool, once again from primary school, where we were playing games. We've got a whole suite of games for people to run around and be the carbon cycle and overwhelm it and poison each other as newts, etc. And right through to policymakers. So here we've got the Mayor of Salford learning the RoundView at the launch of the carbon landscape. Every single project partner learned the RoundView and thought about how that applied to this landscape. Everybody that we worked with in the community groups learned the RoundView, and we use this as part of the thinking into the future for that landscape. And this engagement helped lead to the first post-industrial urban National Nature Reserve, helping also to not just to help people to see bigger about their landscapes and move beyond their own patch, to think of the landscape as a bigger process of transformation, but also helping encourage people to think not just about the landscape restoration, but also about the potential impact on fossil fuel use, on the way that materials flow through that landscape and how people move through that landscape and how that could be more sustainable. So that's where we'd got to just about by the end of the pandemic. Carbon Landscape Project, we did that engagement for the Natural Nature Reserve during the pandemic. A key invention that actually came out of that time was developing three-dimensional learning tools to help teach the principles. Because up until that point, what we found was people really responded well to the round, but felt that they needed to be extremely well versed in the science to teach it. So what we wanted to develop was a series of learning tools that did the heavy lifting of teaching the science principles themselves. So the very first test of these was set out in the National Trust at Quarry Bank. 129,000 participants engaged with these tools. They were just left in the space at Quarry Bank. The first set fell apart. We really felt we've got a huge breakthrough here to crack this idea of how to teach the principles in such a way that anybody could actually use them. And the key inventive breakthrough here was using poetry, art, and the game mechanics to actually make sure that everybody could, that when you play the games, it come together in one way, clicking together so that you get it right. Now, I have to admit, I'm ashamed to admit here that it wasn't the 8-year-old that spelled carbon wrong, it was actually me. So this is me demonstrating the need for such a tool where they click together like a Rubik's Cube to make sure that all of the principles are clear, you get the right answer, and through playing the game, you engage with the material on multiple levels. So we've designed these so they work for people people who are just learning to read, right through to people who might put it together as a poetry game or just as a picture. But by the process of doing that, you learn about the key principles. So this is where we got to. We had these games. We know they work to an extent. But what we really hadn't quite cracked was the interpretive material around them to make sure that they actually worked in different settings. And this was where the Sustainable Futures funding came in. So I was able to run a project working with Manchester UNESCO City of Literature to test and develop a standalone installation in libraries to see how that might work in terms of this working as a learning resource source for communities and schools. So we went from this idea that if we had some banners that introduced it, started to sketch them out, with this funding, we were actually able to design them, get in the first prototypes, put them in the libraries, and have installations at Manchester Central Library and Urmston Library to really test this process. So this funding helped us get installations in time for the Festival of Libraries in 2023. So we had many people visiting the libraries. It was one of the events that was actually put on the library, on the Library Festival of Library program. And obviously this helped us to really raise the profile of what we were doing, and also really key, helped us to test if it would work. I mean, one of the key questions we had was just, will everything get stolen? I don't know. We genuinely didn't know if we could leave these in these public spaces. We kind of knew that if we left it in the National Trust, highly unlikely to get stolen. But how about in central Manchester, in a library? We just didn't know. And the amazing thing is, not only did they stay there, but we just were able to observe. I would walk past on many occasions, and just people, the kits would be in different places, they'd be used, they'd been definitely people engaging with them. And we set up luggage tags and asked for feedback and got a lot of really interesting feedback about what people learned and found out from actually playing these games. So yes, they could be put in these spaces, and yes, people were engaging with them and getting something out of it. So this was incredibly exciting. This is now being taken forward in a British Academy Innovation Fellowship, working with the United Kingdom for UNESCO and with the UNESCO City of Literature as a key partner. And I'm also working with Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere in this fellowship, testing this process in large-scale landscape visioning. So we did this on the Carbon Landscape Project, but that was before we had the three-dimensional tools. In the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere, we've been running workshops all along the River Nith, and running workshops with 200 plus participants, where we've been doing classic community engagement workshop, but then a quick half-hour interjection of the RoundView as part of that workshop. So we'd ask, what do you like about the river? What do you care about in this area? What would you like to see different? Taught the RoundView, and then said, okay, now what else would you like to see? What other ideas would you like to see in this area? And this has been so exciting to see how quickly we could introduce the principles in a fun and engaging way, and what kinds of shifts we're getting in people's thinking and perception when we do that. So that's been part of the proof of principle. And another key question was, will other people pick up these tools and use them? And what's really, really exciting is that a PE teacher said, can I borrow the kits? Started using them in schools. He's been running workshops in schools across the river. The community engagement officer for Out Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere had to do some workshops in schools about climate change, was really worried about it, and then said, oh, I know, I'll just use the RoundView toolkits, developed a whole climate art project around that using the RoundView toolkits. And the key thing we're finding here is, yes, people who aren't feeling confident can go and pick these up and use them in their work. So that has just been so, so exciting. And this idea that it's a one-stop shop for people who don't feel confident in teaching sustainability or incorporating sustainability into their work is really, really thrilling to see. So we've got, from the Sustainable Futures funding, we tested the principle, developed these banners, got them into some spaces. We're starting to see how they can work in different gallery spaces, libraries, etc. Another key aspect that we've been working on is translating the poetry into multiple languages, because obviously if we've got game dynamics that rely on poems, then we're limited if we can only work in English. So we've been working with multilingual poets with Manchester City of Literature to work on these translations. So far, we've got translations into Spanish, French, Arabic, Urdu, Scottish Gaelic, because we're working a lot in Scotland, and Shona, a heritage language of Zimbabwe, because we've been working with a Zimbabwean poet. And it's just so interesting to see how we've improved the English poems, the game dynamics, and learning about how to really turn this into a global learning resource. And this is absolutely key, because our ambition is to turn the RoundView into the fourth R. We want to see reading, writing, arithmetic, and the RoundView as core to how people learn. We would like everybody on the planet to understand the three root causes of all environmental problems, their opposites, and to know that they can apply that in their lives and in their decision making. So what we're looking at now is how we take this further, how we really scale this up into a global learning resource. I want to see this in RoundView games in every single library, engaging with all the schools, bringing this incredible way of thinking into community learning, into major transformation projects, and into school curriculums nationally and internationally. And that's what we're working on at the moment. If people are interested, get in touch, because we're, well, looking for ways to do this and really looking to scale this up and get this out into the world. Thank you very much. And here is some contacts for further information. And do please get in touch with me if you're interested in exploring this further.
Many thanks, Joanne. That's very, really interesting. As before, please put your questions in the chat if you have any, or make yourself aware to me. And whilst people are thinking about this, I've got a few questions for you, Joanne. So what do you think is the main barrier to the wider rollout of this new approach?
Yeah, so I've given you the ambition, haven't I? This is what we're really trying to do. But my goodness, what are the main barriers? I mean, it's not going to surprise anybody if I say money, resources, that's the barrier, of course. But we think actually that because we've got something that's really profoundly scalable, that we're hoping to really interest some can't even pronounce it, philanthropic funding, and we're looking at sort of ways of packaging this so it could be done on a small scale but build over time. So money, but we're looking at ways of overcoming that. But I think another really important one is that we've realized is people's capacity. Almost everybody that we want to work with, librarians, teachers, community officers working in landscape partnership schemes, almost everybody is completely overwhelmed. Too much work, not enough time, not enough resources. So one of the key things we've learned through all of these trials is we've got to find ways to make sure that what we're offering helps support what they've got to do and their own activities, that it isn't seen as an extra, that it's seen as, oh, that will make my life easier. So that's been one of the key things, is really recognizing the lack of capacity. So how do we really make sure that not only we find ways to make it obvious that it's helping people, but also that we communicate that this isn't just some extra thing you've got to do, but it's a support. That, I think those are the two, and I guess the third linked one to that has been timing. So it's not just that people don't have much time, but it's catching organizations at a time when they're open to change, that it's sort of maybe when they're right in the middle of a major project isn't the right time. So we've learned that just because somebody doesn't pick something up straight away, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not useful or interesting to them, but it might just not be at the right time. So we're going to have to work on strategies that give multiple possible entry points so that we might have a higher chance of catching people at the right time. That's what we've learned so far.
You're gonna tell us a little bit more about these poems. Have you learned anything specific about translating them? Anything revealing that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what's just been lovely with this has been the way the translations and the playing with the words has helped us go deeper into the meanings of the poem. So a lovely, well, one example is working with the Arabic poet who's from Bahrain. My first version of the poem was buried in coal. The planet burns as I go up in smoke. And he said, well, coal, that doesn't mean much in Bahrain. And I thought, oh my gosh, it should be buried in coal and oil. But then the Zimbabwean poet said, oh, that doesn't really sound great as a poem. How about buried in coal, buried in oil? Perfect. So it's been not just the language, but also the poetry of it, the concepts and the thinking about how to get that international international linkages. So another classic one for that was the Zimbabwean poet saying, what in one of the poems, it talks about, in whale I swim deep, in a humpback whale I swim deep. And he said, well, in Zimbabwe, we don't really have many whales because we're a landlocked country, but it is a myth. It's almost a mythical creature. So the word for that in Shona might be big thing that could be hunted that swims, which then links just the Scottish Gaelic version of whale is a large sea pig. So it's helped us think a little bit about how we translate some of the concepts and ideas to be more international, and it's been absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you. We've had a question from Sarah Bowie in the chat. Wonderful vision. Thank you, Joanna. I think this is so very helpful for people who would like to do something about climate change, but are a bit overwhelmed by the bigger picture. I'm thinking this could help people realize what is their scope and how to take some actions to change that.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think the big thing we've seen from the analysis we've done of people's response to the RoundView is a shift to hope, from despair to hope, that this is possible, that they could even just see the shape or the contours of what a sustainable future could conceivably look like. And I think then the real challenge is, how do you ground that in the daily actions? And because it is still huge, and the RoundView, to keep its potency, can't be saying things like, therefore thou shalt install a heat pump. It's almost like learning the how to ask the questions. So if you're saying, well, should I do this, should I do that, how do I ask the question about whether or not this is moving in the right direction? And then we also need to give very inspiring examples of actions that people can take in their daily lives, in their work, and in their broader transformative work. So that's definitely been part of the learning process, is how to get that to be resonant for people, and to see that people are part of a larger kind of transformational change process, even when what feels like the small changes perhaps doesn't feel like it's enough.
Thank you. We've just had another question in the chat from Cara McGrath. Do you have any advice for researchers who want to incorporate art, poetry, games, etc. in their work? It sounds like you've had a wonderful benefit from this interdisciplinary work, but it can be a bit intimidating to step outside of your own field of expertise.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, and intimidating, and also academia doesn't it's a we've got the rhetoric that we should be doing interdisciplinary work, but the reality of our structures make it really quite challenging. So, for instance, if it was really interesting talking to the poet. I was been working with Professor John McAuliffe in our poetry, and we were talking about the research excellence framework in the future and what we could put in as a return. And he said, well, just put the poems in. And I thought, yeah, it's not going to work in planning just to put the poems in. So I think the big bit of advice I've got here is being open to exploration, and then having to and being humble. Like I'm learning all the time from this, and I think that's part of what is intimidating for academics. Is we're set up to almost need to feel like we're experts in our field, and obviously you step out of that. There's no way I'm an expert in art and poetry, but I'm able to work with people and then hold on to my own grounding in my own discipline that is recognizing what I will still need to do to keep my foothold in my own discipline. So trying to work out ways to get the project so that everybody who's working on it gets some benefit that works in their discipline and in their way of working. So it's sort of an exploration process together, I would say. And perhaps just starting small with a little project. And this has been very much an iterative process that we've built up over time.
Yes, thank you. I've got one final question. So if anyone has any last ones, put them in. If not, we'll finish with this one. So the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, they're a common thread that go through all of these presentations for Sustainable Futures. And how does the RoundView relate to that? And are there any official links or any work you've done to kind of embed them or to build upon them?
That's an interesting question, because I noticed that we're talking about space and how they link to the SDGs. I would say, in a way, I feel like what was interesting in the early work I was doing with UNESCO UK, they had just done a big piece of work with looking at barriers to implementing the SDGs for site managers. And one of the things they found was lack of capacity. So that's sort of resonant with our own experience. But the other thing was that a lot of the site managers of UNESCO sites, I'll say the biosphere, so people who are managing quite large landscapes, they were struggling to see how to translate the SDGs into anything that meant something on the ground, because they're quite sort of policy and abstract orientated. And I think that the RoundView almost cuts across and sits on top of those, so that if you're saying within any, like, okay, on one level, obviously, if we were getting it into education, it helps towards SDG, the education on the educational SDG. On another level, you could say it helps you think about what we might need to do to get to sustainable consumption or sustainable cities. And I think that's its core thing. Is it's not so much that it maps to any one SDG per se, but it's a habit of mind that would help you to say, if we're thinking about doing this, is it likely to move us towards sustainability? Because I think there's some of the words within the SDGs, it's like, we will have sustainable community. Well, what does that mean? It helps us understand what that might actually mean. So it's more of a kind of way of thinking that cuts across the SDGs than it is mapped to any one SDG. But that's something that I think we're still needing to work on, how we best articulate that to help because obviously everybody's still got to work towards the SDGs and say this is what we're doing towards them, and we need to go beyond just saying, well, obviously it's quality education when it's educational. It's the partnership, it helps with the partnership SDG when it's around the partnerships, but it cuts across and helps make sense of all of the other ones.
Thank you. We've had one last question in the chat, so I promise this is the last one. So what is your goal for broader or international distribution of this work?
Right. Well, apart from global domination, it's the goal. It genuinely is to turn this into a global learning resource. What I think, what we've got is we're setting up that the core ideas are open source, stewarded by a community interest company that I've set up to make sure that they maintain the integrity and the quality of the ideas over time. And part of that work with this early work with translating the poetry has been interesting as well, because it's not just translating the words, it's translating the scientific integrity of the ideas. So as it rolls out, what we're aiming for is that there's this core resonant intellectual set of principles that keeps its integrity, but is expressed in multiple different ways. I would like to see I think the three-dimensional tools are extraordinarily powerful as a way of engaging, and I'm working on ways to get those available. I think through funded projects is most likely, although they will be available for sale for any organization or school that can afford them, or even better, company. So that will hopefully then build some of the money to help the rollout to the countries and the places that can't afford them. So we're sort of looking at a combination of ways to make some money to help with the rollout, to bring in grant funding, and then to steward the open source ideas over time. And we will have parallel digital tools in parallel that can be downloaded free anywhere in the world. But even that isn't free in as much as, say, schools can't often afford to print. So we're really looking at multiple ways of doing this. So it's sort of, the aim is to get this so that anybody on the planet can learn it. The mechanisms are thinking through the network organizations and the nodes like libraries that can reach lots of people. That's what we're looking at the moment. And basically any other institutions or organizations that are interested in using it, they can pick these up and use it. What we ask is, as you learn from that, feedback, so that we can keep learning and improving the tools over time.
Well, thank you to Joanne and thank you to John for presents today. I'm sure they'd appreciate any questions you have afterwards. You get in touch with them. The emails will be in the usual place. That concludes today's session. If you look in the chat quickly, you'll see that we have another session planned for May with the speakers set up there that Emily's kindly put in the chat. Please, so if you want to sign up to that, please do so. If not, please, thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you to our speakers.
Great.
Good afternoon.